So I'll keep this fairly short and hopefully quite simple. I work for the city's climate change agency, and what we do is we help Manchester to meet its climate change targets. So I won't expand on that in any more detail this afternoon. I'm just going to take you briefly through four things. Why is climate change a thing that cities, not just Manchester, but cities around the EU are interested in? Talk a little bit about climate change risks in Manchester. Thirdly, I'll talk about one of the ways in which we're responding through green infrastructure, so trees, green space, parks, etc. And then I'll finish up just trying to bring some clearer definition to what I think the challenge is that we'd like to work with you guys on. Okay, you're not supposed to be able to read the detail of this, but do please follow up when you have time. Climate change is something which is very much affecting cities across the whole of the EU, has been increasingly over the last 20 to 30 years. And what we've got now is a very robust understanding of what some of those impacts are. The way that the European Environment Agency look at this is they break the EU down into different zones. And I suppose the headline for me is that climate change is happening. It's happening now. It's increasing flooding and flood risk in cities across the EU. And heat stress is also increasingly becoming an issue, including in cities like Manchester. We joke, say we'd like better weather, but the key thing around heat is it's relative. So 30 degrees in Manchester might sound great, but when you're used to more like early 20s, those kind of shocks are what really affect particularly vulnerable residents. So flooding and heat stress, very much issues across the whole of Europe. And there's a little bit more information in there. I won't speak to that slide in too much detail, but there's a whole range of ways in which climate change is affecting every aspect of the way that we live, work and travel in cities. I won't talk to this in too much detail, but just to give you a little bit more evidence around what kinds of impacts we're seeing. We're seeing some very, very sizable economic impacts from climate change. Flooding in particular pretty much brings a city to a standstill when people can't travel around, they can't get to work, they can't get to school, they can't get out at night. So three examples there on that slide that you can take a look at when we've got a little bit more time. And then just to kind of orientate us a little bit with the 8 Synchronicity cities, I think 7, all the cities with the exception of Santander, have identified climate change adaptation as one of their key priorities. They're all in slightly different kind of climatic zones as far as the European Environment Agency classify them. But again, I would just draw out those 2 headline risks. Flood risk, heat stress is something that all 7 of those cities want to do something about, Manchester included. So what does climate change look like in Manchester? Well, it looks like that. Looks like that 2 years ago. That's Market Street, which, that's not quite at a standstill, but that certainly doesn't do anything in terms of supporting the local economy. It doesn't attract people to a city where you're literally wading through water to get to the shops, bars and restaurants. So we're seeing versions of that now on pretty much an ongoing basis, be it a flooding incident, be it a heat stress incident, we're seeing this stuff happen now. And we've actually seen a 10-fold increase in the amount of surface water flooding incidents in Manchester over the last 50 years. And we've seen a doubling in the number of heat stress incidents. So again, I'll kind of make that point. This is happening. It's a challenge that's with us right now. But there is some good news. We are starting to respond. One of the key ways in which we can respond is through green stuff, green infrastructure, to give it its kind of more technical term. That can be things like trees in St. Peter's Square, with big tree pits that are designed to soak up lots of water, either to divert it from the sewage network or just delay the flow of water into the sewage network. It looks like things like green roofs. We've got quite a smattering of them around the city centre. I think about 25 at the last count I was involved in. Again, they're particularly good at helping to manage water. And then we see some examples like this, which colleagues from Transport for Greater Manchester have been involved in. Green Walls, that's down at the Deansgate Castlefield stop. So we're seeing a whole host of different examples across the city. And I'll just kind of start to move us now into what is the challenge. We are seeing an uptake in the delivery of green infrastructure, but nowhere near at the rate and scale that we need to respond to the risks of climate change. So we think we need a roughly 10% increase in urban green infrastructure across the city. Given the very dense urban nature of the city of Manchester, you could pretty much apply that 10% target anywhere, but the city centre in particular is a real challenge for us. So, for example, we think that the city centre will be 6 degrees hotter on average by 2050 compared to where it is today. That sounds great, but as a city that's used to the temperatures as we've currently got them, that's a really sharp shock to the system. So there's a challenge to increase urban green space by 10%. And then when we really boil it down to what we're trying to do here, we're trying to mobilise money to do this. Planning where you need to do this stuff is something we're pretty good at. Engaging people to be interested in climate change and green infrastructure, we're quite good at that as well. What we're not good at the moment is working out where the money's going to come from. And what we typically do is we lean on developers to put more into schemes than they might otherwise choose to. And we pick off bits of public sector grant funding when it's available. So as far as a kind of robust funding strategy goes, that's very, very far away from where we want to be as a city. And what will underpin the strategy we're currently trying to develop is monetising the benefits that come from green infrastructure. So this is an excerpt from the city's green infrastructure strategy. We think that the city's parks, for example, save somewhere between £6 and £10 million per year for the NHS through facilitating physical activity. So there's a very clear economic imperative there. And I suppose the other area where I'll try to focus on these last couple of slides is the financial benefit from less surface water going into the sewage network. There's particularly a financial incentive there for United Utilities to do that. And these are, I don't know why they're all numbered 111, but these are the kind of three components to the funding strategy that we're developing at the moment. So one is establish a big enough pipeline of green infrastructure projects to attract investment. What should be bullet point 2 is around establishing those business models and funding mechanisms. So, for example, might we be able to get United Utilities to invest in a green roof retrofit programme across the city centre because less water ends up in their sewage network. And then the third bit, which is absolutely fundamental to this, is the data to validate those business models and prove that we have actually delivered those financial benefits that we said we would do to the funders. So I think where we are at the moment is we've got some work in train to fund those first two areas of activity. We're going to focus in on a couple of particular sectors, possibly commercial property in the city centre and also potentially some housing, social housing estates. So we'll have that in place for bullet points 1 and 2 by the end of this year. Where we currently have a huge gap is around understanding, well, how are we going to monitor and validate those benefits over the long term? The way we do that at the moment is through modelled and fairly static data. So I think the challenge I'd like to explore with you guys is how do we develop a much better real-time understanding of how our green infrastructure is helping to manage climate change risks? And I think that water management, the United Utilities angle is where there's a real opportunity. And I know certainly United Utilities colleagues would be very up for working with those of you in the room. There's a couple of links to further information in there. There's more that we'll probably add to this pack after today. But that's it from me. Hopefully that's a useful brief introduction.